If you still believe the dollar stays strong simply because America says it is strong, then you are trusting a privilege that is already being chipped away in plain sight. Most people do not notice it because they are trained to look only at prices after they rise. They wait until groceries are more expensive, until mortgages cost more, until their savings buy less, until their standard of living feels tighter. And only then do they ask what happened by then. The process is already far along. What is happening now is called de-dollarization. That sounds like one of those cold, technical phrases economists use so ordinary people stop listening. But the reality behind it is simple enough to explain with something ridiculous. Imagine I held up a fuzzy pen and told you it was worth $5. Maybe it is worth $3. Maybe it is worth $10. The exact number does not matter. Now imagine the government announced that private manufacturers must stop producing fuzzy pens, that the state would become the dominant gatekeeper, and that everybody in the country would be required to obtain fuzzy pens to keep living a normal life. Fail to get them, and you get punished. Maybe not with a polite letter, maybe with prison, maybe with a loss of your house, your car, your livelihood. What happens to the value of the fuzzy pen? Demand explodes. The object itself may not be special. The demand forced onto it is what changes everything. That is the right way to think about the dollar. A dollar bill is not magic. It is cotton and linen and confidence. It has no intrinsic value that justifies the amount of goods and labor it can command. The reason it holds power is because demand for it has been enforced and reinforced through the legal system, the tax system, the debt system, and the global trade system. If you live in America, you need dollars because you pay taxes in dollars. You miss enough taxes, and the government does not shrug and wish you luck. It comes for you. You fail to pay your property taxes, and they can take your house. You fail to pay your auto loan, and they can take your car. You fail to pay enough of your obligations, and the legal consequences pile up quickly. That is domestic demand. Then there is external demand, and that is where the real privilege lived. For decades, if a nation wanted to buy oil from the Middle East, it needed dollars. That was the Petrodollar system. The world's 10 most important commodity was linked to America's currency in a way that forced governments, corporations, and central banks to keep obtaining and holding dollars. And when countries accumulate dollars, they do not usually leave them idle. They recycle them into U.S. treasuries. That matters more than most Americans realize. It means foreign demand for dollars fed directly into foreign demand for American debt. That gave the United States an extraordinary advantage. Washington could spend beyond its means for longer than a normal country could. It could borrow more cheaply. It could issue oceans of debt and still find buyers. It could preserve a stronger currency than its underlying fiscal discipline really deserved. That privilege helped support a higher standard of living in America than would otherwise have been possible. It also made Americans complacent. A great many people came to believe the dollar was strong because it was naturally strong. It was strong because demand for it was engineered, incentivized, enforced, and globalized. And once you understand that, you understand the danger. If less oil is traded in dollars, demand for dollars falls. If central banks want fewer dollar reserves, demand for dollars falls. If foreign governments decide treasuries are no longer the safest or smartest place to store surplus capital, demand for dollars falls. And if demand for dollars falls, then the dollar's value does not stay where it was out of patriotism. It weakens. Once the currency weakens, everything downstream gets harder. Imports cost more. Inflation pressure rises. Interest rates trend higher because the government must offer more yield to attract buyers. Mortgage costs rise. Auto loans rise. Student debt costs rise. The cost of living presses harder while wages lag behind. That is the actual consequence of de-dollarization. Not a dramatic headline first, a slower squeeze first. Most Americans are not prepared for that because most Americans still assume the old system is basically intact. I do not. De-dollarization is not one event. It is not some single Friday afternoon where the world gathers and declares the dollar finished. It is a process. It happens in marginal shifts first. A little less trade in dollars, a little more settlement in local currencies, a little less appetite for treasuries, a little more gold in reserves, a little less automatic trust in the U.S. financial system, a little more hedging against American sanctions, deficits, and money printing. Then one day people looked back and realized the process had been happening for years. That is where we are. One of the clearest signs came from the reserve composition of central banks as of early 2026. Gold overtook us treasuries as the world's largest central bank reserve asset for the first time in roughly 3 decades. That is not some niche statistic for economists to debate in a quiet room. That is a loud signal. It means the institutions that sit closest to the money printers, the institutions with the deepest incentive to protect national reserves, have been reallocating away from treasuries and toward gold. Think about that carefully for years. The reserve system was built on the assumption that treasuries were the premier store of official wealth. Now gold has taken the lead. Why? There are several reasons, but the largest are easy to understand. First, the dollar has been weaponized. Second, the U.S. government has become fiscally reckless. Third, the Federal Reserve has repeatedly chosen money creation over discipline. Start with weaponization, because that is where a lot of countries woke up. In 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies froze a huge portion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets became inaccessible. From Washington's perspective, that was economic pressure. From the perspective of every other country on earth, it was a warning. It said this very clearly: if your savings are held inside the dollar system, they can be frozen if you fall out of political alignment with the United States. That changed the psychology of reserve management. A reserve asset is supposed to be safe, liquid, and available when you need it. The moment major countries realize access can be turned off with a keystroke, the question changes from what earns the best yield to what can be seized the least easily. Gold suddenly looks different in that world. Gold does not need a Western clearing system to exist. Gold does not depend on another state's permission once it is in your vault. Gold cannot be frozen remotely in the same way a foreign reserve account can. That is one major reason central banks started diversifying more aggressively. Then there is the second problem, and this one is even harder to defend. The United States government is spending far more than it takes in. Say the government brings in about $5 trillion in taxes and spends around $7 trillion. The exact labels on the spending may change from year to year, but the gap is what matters. How do you spend 7 when you collect 5? You borrow the difference. That means issuing more treasuries, more promises, more debt. Now put that beside the scale of the existing debt load, which is already approaching $40 trillion. Ask yourself a basic question. How do you ever pay down a debt mountain of that size when you keep adding to it every year? You do not. Not honestly. And if the debt is not realistically repayable through fiscal discipline and growth, then people holding that debt begin asking a different question. They stop asking whether they will technically get paid. They start asking what kind of dollars they will be repaid in. That is where money printing enters the story. When there are not enough natural buyers of debt at the rates the system wants, the Federal Reserve steps in and expands liquidity. The mechanics may be dressed up in respectable language. The labels can sound clever, but the outcome is the same: more dollars, more support for a debt system that no longer clears on confidence alone. So yes, a foreign government can buy treasuries and receive interest, but if the dollars being paid back are worth less and less in real terms, then the nominal interest does not solve the underlying problem. This is why the combination of fiscal irresponsibility and money printing pushes countries to look for alternatives. And the alternatives are already being built. The dollar is still dominant. I am not arguing otherwise. Most global trade still touches the dollar. Most commodities are still priced in dollars. The old system has not vanished, but a process does not have to finish before it becomes dangerous. The erosion is enough. You are now seeing more bilateral trade settled in local currencies. You are seeing more countries experiment with payment systems outside the old Western architecture. You are seeing reserve diversification into gold. You are seeing a gradual reduction in the assumption that every important transaction must flow back through the dollar. And one of the saddest parts is this: Washington itself has accelerated the process sanctions, financial coercion, fiscal excess. And careless abuse of monetary privilege did not reinforce trust. They weakened it. Look at Russia again. The broad strategy was to isolate it, starve it of financing, and bend it through the power of the dollar system. Some damage was done, certainly, but Russia adapted. It increased trade with non-Western partners. It shifted more transactions into other currencies. It built alternative channels. That does not mean sanctions failed in every respect. It means the rest of the world learned from the attempt. And the lesson many countries drew was simple: reduce dependence on a system that can be used against you. That is de-dollarization accelerating through necessity. Not ideology. Then look at Iran here. The issue becomes even more direct. A great deal of Iranian oil flows to China. Much of that trade is not settled in dollars. It is settled in yuan. Now think through the full chain, because this is where most people miss the actual mechanism. If Iran sold its oil in dollars, those dollars would enter the dollar ecosystem. A large share of those proceeds would likely circle back into U.S. financial channels, directly or indirectly. Some would end up supporting Treasury demand. Some would support trade and investment tied to the American system. But that is not at the structure. Now, Iran sells oil to China. Iran gets paid in yuan. Iran then uses yuan to buy Chinese goods, machinery, industrial equipment, electronics, chemicals, steel, manufactured inputs, and more. That means the trade loop stays outside the dollar. No dollar demand gets created for that transaction. No forced Treasury demand follows from it. And because energy is one of the largest markets in the world, even incremental shifts matter. Every barrel settled outside the dollar is one less barrel reinforcing the old order. That is why energy trade matters so much in the de-dollarization discussion. The petrodollar was never just about oil. It was about the automatic monetary demand that oil created. Once that automatic demand weakens, the effects show up where they always show up first, in the Treasury market. That is the best scoreboard for the process. If countries transact heavily in dollars, they accumulate dollars. If they accumulate dollars, they need a place to park them. That place has historically been treasuries. Strong demand for treasuries pushes yields down. Low yields make borrowing cheaper for Washington. Low yields also make borrowing cheaper for American households and businesses. Mortgage rates benefit, auto loans benefit, student loans benefit, asset valuations generally benefit. Now imagine that same process running in reverse. If fewer countries need dollars, fewer countries accumulate them. If fewer countries accumulate them, fewer countries need treasuries. If demand for treasuries weakens, yields rise. And if yields rise in a country already drowning in debt, the burden compounds quickly. This is why I say de-dollarization is not some abstract academic topic. It is a direct threat to future purchasing power and future financing conditions in the United States. You can explain it to yourself with a simple analogy. Imagine Michael Jordan says he needs to borrow money. People line up because his reputation is strong, demand is high, and lenders feel confident. Somebody says, I will lend at 4%. Somebody else says, I will do it at 3%. Another says, I will do it at 2%. Strong demand drives down the rate. Now imagine an unknown borrower with no such trust. Fewer lenders show up. They demand much higher interest. They want compensation for uncertainty. That is what happens to debt when demand weakens. The U.S. does not become some obscure borrower overnight, of course, but when the direction of demand changes, the price of borrowing changes too, and a government sitting under nearly $40 trillion of debt cannot afford to pretend that does not matter. So where does this leave an ordinary American in an uncomfortable truth? If you keep all your confidence in the dollar system while the institutions closest to the system are quietly reducing their own dependence on it, you are not being prudent. You are being late. Now, let me be clear. I am not telling you the dollar disappears tomorrow. I am not telling you to behave like a man waiting for the world to end in the next 48 hours. I am telling you that the direction of travel matters more than the comforting story on television. The trend is what destroys you first. A weaker dollar means your money buys less. A weaker dollar means imported goods, energy-sensitive goods, and many necessities become more expensive. A weaker dollar means higher financing costs over time if Treasury demand continues to erode. A weaker dollar means your nominal wage can rise while your real life gets harder. That is how a country can appear richer on paper while ordinary people feel poorer in practice. And if you want to protect yourself, you have to think like an owner of scarce assets, not like a passive saver waiting for policy to rescue him. My own answer to that problem is simple. I want exposure to gold. Physical gold if you understand storage and custody, gold through market vehicles. If that suits your structure better, gold miners, royalty companies, and streaming businesses, if you understand the added business risk and want leverage to the underlying metal. Why gold? Because that is where official demand is already moving, because central banks themselves are telling you, through their actions, what they trust more. When monetary discipline breaks down, because gold is not someone else's liability, because no central bank can print more of it to solve a political problem, because when reserve managers begin moving away from treasuries and toward metal, I pay attention. This does not mean gold is the only answer. It does mean gold belongs in the conversation, if your goal is not to become poorer quietly while pretending nothing changed. If you ignore dollarization, you are effectively making a bet that the old reserve system will remain strong enough, trusted enough, and demanded enough to keep carrying America the way it has for decades. I would not make that bet with blind confidence. Not now, not with reserve composition already changing, not with sanctions having taught every major country how vulnerable dollar assets can become, not with fiscal policy, this reckless, not with money creation, this normalized, not with more energy trade moving outside the dollar, and not with the Treasury market standing as the place where all of these tensions eventually settle. The people who will suffer most from this process are the ones who never realize it is happening until it shows up as a lower standard of living. The people who adapt do not wait for perfect clarity. They notice where demand is leaving. They notice where reserves are moving. They notice which assets cannot be printed. And they position before the language of the crisis becomes obvious to everybody else. That is how I would think about it. Not with panic, not with slogans, with structure, with incentives, with demand, with flows, and with the sober understanding that a privilege can erode long before a system officially dies. That is what de-dollarization really is, not a headline, not a conspiracy phrase, a long, grinding reduction in forced demand for the dollar. And if that process continues, the cost will not be paid first by the people printing the money, it will be paid by the people still saving in blind trust that the money being printed remains as strong as it used to be.